Hey everybody, Sam here. I am excited to walk you through the assembly of the XT60 capacitor pigtail. The tools you're going to need to do this are a pair of wire cutters and strippers, a set of snips or really of cutters for the ends of the capacitor leads, and a flathead screwdriver. You will also need a soldering iron, some solder, and I always, especially because of the nature of 3D printed parts and TPU especially, I try to keep a little bit of liquid flux on hand to reduce the amount of time I actually have to heat the solder in order to make great connections. So let's get started. Let's walk through it. The first step is to take your 3D printed capacitor pigtail provision and insert the XT60 cap into it. So it's pretty simple. You just push it in, wait until it is flush, right? Next, what I will do is I will take a pair of, if you have a pair of like needle nose pliers or something, that'll work too. I just use these, and I twist the bullet connectors so they make kind of a 45-degree angle down from where you can see the capacitor leads are going to pop out from. That's important to make a good connection, because otherwise you'll end up on top of the leads and it's kind of hard to manipulate later on. So that's step one. You've got the cap in place. Step two is we're going to take our capacitor and we're going to take two half-inch pieces. Half-inch is the important note here, because that's almost the perfect length to go from the end of the capacitor all the way through to the bullet connector output here on the back of the 3D printed part. Half-inch pieces of, I believe this is 1 millimeter almost inner diameter heat shrink tubing. You're going to put it onto both capacitor leads, and you're going to do a quick heat shrink. I'm going to do this off video. Sorry, I just did that off video, but you can see I put the heat shrink tubing right over the capacitor leads. This is important because when you fish this through and come out the back, you want to make sure that the capacitor leads aren't exposed for shorting out on anything. So half-inch is going to be just the right amount of distance that you're going to see, where when it comes out of the back of this 3D printed part, it's going to connect right into, it's going to line right up perfectly with those bullet connector leads. So what you're going to do here is actually a trick here to feeding this through, and this is actually probably the most difficult part of the whole the whole assembly here, is you want to make sure, number one, you're lining up the negative lead with the negative terminal on the XT60 connector and the positive lead with the positive terminal. And that is indicated by two things. Number one, the capacitor short end of the lead that it will come with is the negative side. The long end is the positive side. So when you feed these through, you want to make sure you feed it through with the short end and the negative symbol on the negative terminal of your XT60. Now the trick to doing this is I take just about any tool handle, anything with a rounded edge, and I kind of just loop it over the top of that and make a little tiny hook. See how that kind of hooks down? And I'm going to do that on both leads, right? That makes it easier to fish this through the capacitor pigtail provision, right? And so what you're going to do then is inside there, which is going to be hard to see, there's two little holes that line up at a radial curve to these holes that come out the back. And again, ensuring once again that I'm connecting the positive side of the capacitor through the positive terminal, I'm going to go ahead and just fish this little guy through. And this is just a little little process. You get the hang of it over time, but you do have to make sure that you get those in, because if you bunch up these capacitor endpoints, the capacitor leads, you're going to have a bad day, trying to fix that through. So once they get in there and they start feeding through, you'll feel it click right away. And I think we got it here. Let's give it a little, to make sure we're not, nope, see, we're not doing it. We're just going to have to flex those out a little bit. Maybe we'll edit that out of the video. But you're gonna take those, and once again, let me just go ahead and try to feed this through. This is the single hardest part of the whole process. But once you get it in there, oh, see, now it's in there. They're starting to pop through. And what you want to do is just want to gently fish this through, just like so. What I like to do is I like to bend these leads up as they come out, and then what I'll do is I'll push down on them slightly as I'm pushing through, just to make a little space for that heat shrink tubing to pop through. And if you've done your job right and you've cut that heat shrink tubing to length, you'll see that they end almost perfectly at the top of those capacitors, or at the top of the bullet connector outputs there. So there you go, that's step one. This is actually the hardest part, is feeding that capacitor through. So at this point, you've got your negative terminal lined up with your negative terminal, you've got your positive lined up with your positive, you've got the heat shrink on, you've got the capacitor mostly connected. We're just going to pretty much solder this at this point. So the trick that I do to get these leads in place and out of the way is, first I make sure that guy is seated in there really good, because once it, you don't want to have to be fooling around with it when it's seated. Then I take my flathead screwdriver, I push it right to the end, I flex it up just a hair, and I push that lead, right down into the end of the bullet connector. And that's going to sit it, as you can see, nice and perpendicular to the inside, and seat it right to the back of that bullet connector. Plenty of room for a little bit of tinning from your solder. So I'm going to do the same thing here. Just going to take this guy, and I'm going to bend it slightly, and I'm going to take my flathead, and I'm just going to squish it in there, just like that. And then you can see it's actually nice and flush, and you've got just a little bit of excess that's coming out of there, but otherwise that thing is really in place. So you can kind of play with these a little bit, get them in place really well, make sure that they're seated, and you're not going to have a problem soldering for yourself later on. But once they're in place, you're just going to want to go ahead and clip off the ends of the leads. And then what we're going to do is we're going to tin these up. We're going to strip our 5-inch bits of wire here, and then we're going to start soldering. And this is the fun part. So what we're going to do is, you're going to need something like a helping hand. I prefer these, multi Dr. Octopus arms personally, but anything will do. Make sure that you have enough space to work and apply some solder while not keeping that TPU too hot. So one note about soldering: a lot of people try to solder these big components or these battery leads with a little needle point end, which is for fine components on their on their board. But actually you want something with a little bit of, maybe, I think this is a 2mm flat edge chisel tip soldering gun. I actually use a Weller Digital. I use about 700 degrees when I do this way I can get in and out really fast. I don't have to linger too long on the connections. The trick here, really, to not melting the TPU, is be in and out really fast, and don't linger too long. So I'm just going to go ahead and tin this guy up. There you go. So we tinned one side. I'm going to flip it over. Just going to go ahead and tin the other side. Get a little solder over there and make sure we got a good tinning there. That's important. There we go. That's a good tin. So it should look like this when you're done soldering it up, which is, you want to make sure you've got enough solder on there, right, that when you heat it up later, you're not going to have to add anymore, because you don't want to spend too long lingering on this connector. And you can actually see in the bottom, we haven't melted any TPU at all, right? We've come in from the edge on the side, and we kind of soldered those up. So next I'm just going to strip my wires. Give a little bit. You don't want too much here. Now the trick here is maybe get about a 1/4 inch. They don't need to be super long, right? Those stripped ends, you make them too long, they're going to be hanging off. They're going to be tough, super tough to shrink wrap over. They're going to be sticking off real far. So I go about a 1/4 inch, right? 1/4 inch does me pretty well. Sometimes I like to use a little bit wider of a thing here. And 1/4 inch is about right. So let's go ahead and tin these up now. And what I like to do before I tin these wires, just again in the spirit of making sure you're not sitting for too long on that on that solder connection, I just put a little flux on here. Overflux it, because you're going to definitely burn some out, and you don't want to be sitting there on the TPU with a cold solder that's not melting. So I put a little extra flux on there just for good measure before I before I tin them. And this way they're overfluxed to begin with. And when I actually get in there with my soldering iron later, when I try to connect these two pieces together, I'm not sitting there waiting for cold solder to melt, because the flux is going to transfer that heat nice and quick. So I'm just going to go ahead and warm this up. Get that guy going here. There we go. And again, the trick is making sure you've got enough solder on there to make this lead good and ready for connection. You don't want to be sitting there with you don't want to be sitting there for too long. making that connection later. And make sure you just roll it around, make sure you got connection all the way around. We're going to put one more drop of liquid flux on the component itself before we solder, just to make sure that once again everything comes together nice and smooth. And always make sure you're working with a clean solder tip. This is the last thing you want is a cold connection here, because fighting to replace these wires is not fun. So just go ahead and heat this up. Heat it up, get a little, yeah. There we go. So again, just making sure that there's plenty of solder on that wire. I apologize, I'm working around the camera here. I've never done this before, so it's quite an interesting experience. I'm trying to work around the camera, so I'm struggling a little bit. So there you go. Now you've got your two wires. They should be really well fluxed. They should be really well tinned here, which is the key to making sure this is all successful. And what we're going to do is I'm actually going to just take a little drop of rubbing alcohol before I make any other connections here. I'm going to clean these off so we're not burning rubber, and we get a nice clean connection on the other side that looks nice and shiny, which is what everybody always goes for here. So I'm just going to clean these off with a little bit of rubbing alcohol, and you can see how nice they come out. So last step, and we're just about done, is get this pigtail provision in place. Right? Make sure that you've got a nice, and I like to actually, what I do is I put it right down to the ground, so this way when I'm pushing down on it, I'm not fighting gravity there, right? So here we go. This is the last step, most important. Make sure that you are, again, lining up. I can tell by the gold and the edge of the connector that I'm on the negative terminal, so I'm going to make sure I'm using my negative battery lead here, and I'm going to sit this on there, and then we're going to just heat this whole thing up. But first, like I said, what we're going to do is we're going to take a little drop, just a tiny little drop. When this comes out, you'll see it. Just a little tiny baby drop of liquid flux. See that guy, little drop out there? Just going to put it right on there. Right on there. This is a tool that every person who is soldering should have in their toolkit. And let's hope that my nerves hold up here while I put this guy together. Right, so all I'm going to do is I'm going to sit this on there, and then I'm going to heat it up. And all I want to do is just heat. I'm going to heat it, position it a little bit. As soon as I get that nice flowy melt, it's going to come right off it. Look at that. That's a beautiful connection. Quality 100. Look at that. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. And again, for those guys who have trouble soldering, the trick here is this little bit of liquid flux. A lot of people struggle with it. They're heating, or they're running their iron too low. It's at 600, it's at 650. I run that sucker hot. Put that guy up to 700. This way you just got to get in and get out. Use a little bit of liquid flux here. We're going to put another drop on there, put another drop on this wire. And again, I'm over fluxing here because I don't want to melt this TPU, and I don't want to heat up that capacitor, because you heat up that capacitor, you'll fry it. And then it's just not going to work for you anymore. And that's going to be, a super bad day. So last step here is we're going to get our soldering iron again. We're going to go ahead, route this around the camera, because again, I'm working with something I haven't really typically done before. Get myself well positioned here so I don't screw it up. I'm going to get on top of it, and I am just going to go ahead and heat. You can see the smoke coming up. You can see it heating up in there. There we go. See it heat right up. And then once I get that nice flow, those bubbles, I'm just going to drag it right off. And there you can see I have made a really great connection once again. That's a beautiful connection. The very, very last step, we take that off, you take a good look at that. Those are good connections. No melted TPU, no melted anything. We're looking really good. So now I'm going to take my two pieces of 14 gauge, or however it's calculated, heat shrink tubing. I'm going to go ahead and slide it right over those two connections. And I'm just going to, what I do is I like to actually hold them down a little bit like that. I push them in, while I kind of heat this up. And I'm going to do that off camera with my heat gun, but you can imagine what that's going to be like when you do it yourself. Remember, I push them down a little bit with my thumb just to get them good and seated in there. before I make the final little blast with my heat gun. And so there it is. That's the whole capacitor pigtail assembled. I think that took just about 10 minutes total, or maybe a little bit more with the video. I was fumbling around a bit with some stuff, but that's it. It's beautiful. Love that connection. Great little utility. Thank you.